Before this story begins, a word of respect. The presenter speaks as an outsider, an Australian scholar addressing an American subject, aware that to explore another nation's heritage is, as it were, to swim in someone else's pond. What follows is not a polemic, but an historical appreciation, an account grounded in verifiable sources, examined with reverence for accuracy and for the people whose story it tells. It is offered in the spirit of fraternity, scholarship, and truth. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation from the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. Boston Harbor, March 1775. The city stirs with the noise of empire, soldiers on the wharf, the smell of tanned leather, the murmuring of taverns. Amidst this bustle, 15 free black men assemble beneath the banner of a travelling military lodge of the British Army, its number 441 on the roll of the Grand Lodge of Ireland. Under the light of a single lantern, these men, including a leather worker and community leader named Prince Hall, kneel to receive the degrees of Freemasonry. Thus begins one of the most remarkable sagas in the moral history of the Atlantic world. Prince Hall himself remains an elusive figure. His date and place of birth are uncertain. Some early sources, now regarded with skepticism, suggested Barbados, while most modern scholars, including historian James Sidbury of Rice University, situate his life firmly in New England. By the 1770s, Hall was a literate, property-owning freeman in Boston, a leather craftsman and small-scale entrepreneur, a Methodist preacher, and an outspoken advocate for education among black Bostonians. He petitioned the Massachusetts legislature in 1777 for the establishment of a school for African American children, arguing, in language echoing the Enlightenment, that every rational being hath a right to the advantage of education. Such petitions, preserved in the Massachusetts archives, show a man both pragmatic and visionary, a craftsman with the moral clarity of a reformer. In that same Enlightenment spirit, Hall was drawn to the fraternity of Freemasonry, whose teachings of liberty, equality, and brotherhood resonated with his conviction that black men too were heirs to the dignity of reason. Yet the lodges of colonial Boston were closed to him. When Hall and his companions applied to the White St. John's Lodge, they were rejected, purely on grounds of race. Refusing exclusion, Hall sought Masonic light elsewhere. The military lodge attached to the 38th Regiment of Foot under the Irish warrant accepted the petition. On the 6th of March 1775, Hall and his brethren were initiated. Their new lodge, called simply the African Lodge, was permitted to meet, process in public, and bury its dead, but not to confer degrees. When the British troops departed at the end of the Revolutionary War, the lodge was left in limbo. Prince Hall, aware that Masonic legitimacy rested on chartered authority, petitioned the Grand Lodge of England. After years of correspondence across the war-torn Atlantic, a formal warrant was issued on the 29th of September 1784, naming the body African Lodge Number 459 on the English Registry. The original document, still preserved in Boston's Masonic archives, arrived by ship 3 years later and was read aloud in May 1787. With that act, African Lodge number 459 became, as historian Ann Seymour wrote in her 2020 American Heritage article, The Secret History of Prince Hall Freemasonry, the first black institution in the United States to hold legal standing under British authority. It was, in every technical sense, a regular Masonic lodge. Its only difference lay in the colour of its members' skin. Hall himself served as master and later received from England the title of Provincial Grand Master for African Lodges in North America. In 1791, he authorised lodges in Philadelphia and Providence. By his death in 1807, they had formed a rudimentary African Grand Lodge. Afterward, as Seymour notes, his followers renamed it in his honour, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge, a name now borne by jurisdictions across the world. Let their colour be what it will. In 1797, addressing his brethren in Boston, Prince Hall delivered words that remain luminous with moral courage. Give the right hand of affection and fellowship to whom it justly belongs. Let their colour and complexion be what it will. Let their nation be what it may, for they are your brethren, and it is your indispensable duty to do so. Those lines survive in his published charge to the African Lodge, printed in Boston that year and reissued by blackpast.org. They testify to a man who understood fraternity as moral universality, yet the new republic refused to hear him. White Grand Lodges in America declined to recognize the African Lodge's charter, even though it came from the same English authority that had chartered their own. Their objections were cloaked in the language of exclusive jurisdiction, the doctrine that only one Grand Lodge could operate within a state, but the underlying motive was racial exclusion. As Masonic historian Christopher Hodapp has written, African Lodge was regular in every sense, except the one that mattered most in America. It was black. Exclusion and endurance. Throughout the 19th century, Prince Hall Freemasonry developed as a parallel world. Lodges multiplied, first in the northeast, then following the Great Migration of freedmen into the South and Midwest after the Civil War. Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Georgia all saw Prince Hall Grand Lodges established before the century's end. Yet recognition never came. In 1875, the Southern Masonic writer Albert Pike, a former Confederate officer, expressed his opposition with chilling clarity. I took my obligations to white men, not to Negroes, he wrote. When I have to accept Negroes as brothers or leave Masonry, I shall leave it. These words, printed in Pike's correspondence and later cited in Roger J. Williams' study, Prince Hall Masonic Recognition, The First Step, 1983, have been contested by some scholars who argue they were private rather than official. Still, they reveal the sentiment that dominated mainstream American Masonry for generations. Despite exclusion, Black Masons flourished. Harold Holzer, historian of the early Republic, observed that for free, blacks in northern cities, lodges and churches provided the only autonomous institutions in which African Americans could assemble without white supervision. In that crucible of limited freedom, Prince Hall lodges became schools of leadership, their rituals blending moral discipline with civic training. As Holzer notes, it was not only a place of secrecy, but of self-formation. The founding of Mother Bethel, Philadelphia, 1791. Inside St. George's Methodist Church, black worshippers are ordered to move to the balcony during prayer. Among them stand two Prince Hall Masons, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. They rise, refuse humiliation, and walk out. With support from their Masonic brethren, they found the Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first independent black denomination in America. Historians of the AME Church record that Prince Hall lodges provided moral and material backing for Allen and Jones, and the church's stained glass windows still display Masonic symbols in gratitude. The story is not allegory. It is documentation of how the Masonic ideal of human equality seeded the growth of black religious autonomy. Prince Hall himself supported early plans for African resettlement, part of the late 18th century Back to Africa movement promoted by the British abolitionist Granville Sharp. But his primary commitment was to education and civic virtue at home. In letters preserved in Boston's archives, he argued that moral improvement would break down the walls of ignorance and prejudice. By the mid-19th century, Prince Hall lodges extended throughout the Free States. In 1847, several of them formed a National Grand Lodge, sometimes called the National Compact, hoping to unite their efforts. Yet internal disagreements over state autonomy caused schism. By the 1870s, the national body had fractured into competing jurisdictions. From these divisions emerged two principal streams still recognized today. Prince Hall affiliated Grand Lodges, tracing descent from the Massachusetts body, and Prince Hall Origin Lodges, descended from the National Compact. The distinction is technical but important, and modern scholars such as Alton Roundtree have cautioned against treating Prince Hall Masonry as a single monolith. Even so, the fraternity's moral stature grew. After emancipation, Prince Hall lodges became vital engines of mutual aid, offering burial insurance, education funds, and social leadership. By the early 20th century, their members included ministers, teachers, businessmen, and professionals, the very backbone of the black middle class. The Lincoln Meeting, Washington, D.C., August 1862. President Abraham Lincoln summons 5 black leaders to the White House. Among them, 4 are Prince Hall Masons. Lincoln proposes colonization, the voluntary emigration of freed slaves to Central America. "Your people," he says, "are the cause of the war." The delegation listens, then declines. They answer, in dignified tones recorded by contemporary newspapers, that African Americans are native to this country and intend to remain. As historian Seymour remarks, their refusal quietly redirected the course of emancipation. Without their intervention, she writes, there might be no Black Washington today. This moment exemplifies the moral poise taught within lodge rooms, restraint without submission, reason over anger, courage expressed through calm. From segregation to civil rights. After Reconstruction, Prince Hall Masonry spread with migration. By 1900, there were established Grand Lodges in most states, including in the South, where racial terror was endemic. Even under Jim Crow, lodges served as sanctuaries for civic organization. In Mississippi, the M.W. Stringer Grand Lodge building in Jackson, completed in 1955, became headquarters for the state NAACP. When civil rights leader Medgar Evers, himself a Prince Hall Mason, was assassinated in 1963, his funeral was held there. Ann Seymour notes that the Stringer Temple became the heart of the civil rights struggle in Mississippi, a Masonic edifice serving as both fortress and forum. Across the nation, Prince Hall lodges provided meeting halls for the NAACP, the Urban League, and later the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As the civil rights historian Aldon Morris observes in The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, Free Press, 1984, such institutions formed the organizational backbone of protest. In that sense, Prince Hall Masonry functioned as a hidden architecture of freedom. Among its members were many who shaped 20th century America: labor leader A. Philip Randolph, organizer of the 1963 March on Washington; civil rights strategist Ralph Abernathy; Congressman John Lewis of Georgia, whose activism stretched from Selma to the Capitol; and the jurist Thurgood Marshall, architect of Brown v. Board of Education. All were Prince Hall Masons. As historian Christopher Hodapp summarized, 90% of the founders of Black Greek letter fraternities had Masonic ties. The lodge was the seedbed of leadership. The Lodge and the Dream, Atlanta, early 1960s. On Auburn Avenue, the headquarters of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference stands next door to the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Georgia. Beneath that roof, ministers, lawyers, and activists, many of them Masons, meet in the evenings to plan boycotts and marches. The historian Ed Bowen, himself a 33-degree Mason, later recalled, "Most of the ministers on Auburn Avenue were Masons. So were the doctors and the lawyers. The lodge was where you got things done." Though King himself was never initiated, his father, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., was a member, and rumors long persisted that the younger King had been made a Mason posthumously. Grandmaster Benjamin Barksdale later clarified that no such posthumous initiation occurred, but the very plausibility of the rumor illustrates the fraternity's intimate presence within the civil rights generation. Recognition and reconciliation. For more than 2 centuries, mainstream, predominantly white, Grand Lodges in America withheld recognition from their Prince Hall counterparts. As late as 1947, when the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts briefly granted recognition, pressure from southern jurisdictions forced a retraction. The historian Alton Roundtree remarks that, "For decades, the wall of segregation within Masonry mirrored the wall of segregation in the nation." A change of conscience began only in the 1980s. In 1989, the Grand Lodge of Connecticut voted to recognize the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of that state, the first such act in the United States. Within a decade, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and Colorado followed. Hodapp describes this moment as a collective realization that the fraternity had become a prisoner of its own past. By the early 21st century, most states had acted. Yet, the Deep South lagged. As late as 2017, 6 Grand Lodges, among them Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Arkansas, and West Virginia, still withheld recognition. Gradually, they relented. In 2021, the Grand Lodge of Tennessee extended recognition. Later that year, Georgia followed, passing the motion by overwhelming vote. These developments were documented by Hodapp and corroborated in official Grand Lodge proceedings. Recognition, in Masonic terms, means mutual acknowledgement of legitimacy and the right of members to visit one another's lodges. It does not imply merger. Prince Hall and mainstream Grand Lodges remain sovereign, parallel institutions united by respect. As one Southern Grand Master phrased it after the vote, "We have discovered that we are, after all, of the same light." The Funeral of John Lewis, Atlanta, 2020. The body of Congressman John Lewis lies in state. For the first time in Georgia's history, officers of both the Prince Hall Grand Lodge and the mainstream Grand Lodge stand together to conduct a joint Masonic funeral. As reported by Ann Seymour, 2 centuries of separation were, for an hour, dissolved. The image of white and black Masons side by side, their aprons gleaming under the cathedral lights, became a parable of reconciliation achieved through ritual. Global reach. Today, Prince Hall Freemasonry extends far beyond American borders. Grand lodges exist in Canada, the Caribbean, Liberia, and West Africa. Lodges under Prince Hall jurisdiction operate on US military bases across Europe and Asia, their banners carried wherever American soldiers serve. In 1993, a Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the Caribbean was inaugurated in Barbados. In 2022, one was chartered in São Paulo, Brazil. Membership estimates vary, but most scholars, including Alton Roundtree, place the global figure around 300,000 members in over 5,000 lodges, making it the largest predominantly African-American fraternal organization in existence. In 1996, the United Grand Lodge of England formally declared Prince Hall lodges regular and in amity, thus closing a circle opened more than 2 centuries earlier. The present and the promise. Modern Prince Hall Masonry stands as both an heir to and a custodian of history. Its members sponsor scholarships, support historically black colleges, and engage in community philanthropy. Youth programs, such as the Knights of Pythagoras, teach leadership to adolescents. In cities from Boston to Los Angeles, lodge halls host food drives, literacy classes, and voter registration events. Prince Hall Masonry remains predominantly African American, yet racially open. Men of all ethnicities may petition its lodges, just as black men now freely join mainstream ones. The old barriers have crumbled. But the fraternity's cultural distinctiveness endures, a lineage of resilience, service, and spiritual dignity. As Christopher Hodapp observed in an interview for American Heritage, Prince Hall Masonry survives not because it is separate, but because it is faithful to its founder's vision of universal brotherhood and moral excellence. For a deep dive into the history, philosophy, and traditions of Freemasonry, subscribe to From the Quarries. You will find hundreds of lectures, presentations, shorts, and other Masonic works written by Freemasons for Freemasons. Visit fromthequarries.com or YouTube at From the Quarries.